Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on whereabouts you are in the world today. I'm Gwen Bernard. I'm a member of Rodemos el Diálogo. I'm just going to say a few words to those of you who haven't been with us before, so that you all know what Rodemos el Diálogo is and have a little bit of an idea of why we're holding this event today. And then I'll hand over to Andrei, who is going to chair this panel today. And we're really happy for this event to be the first event that we're doing in conjunction with the University of Winchester, of which Andrei is a senior research fellow. So this is a great new partnership, and it's the first in a series of events in English that we think it's important to do to discuss the ongoing conflict with the ELN guerrilla in Colombia, and keep the issue of the ELN conflict on the table for an Anglophone audience, because sometimes it gets dropped off in importance. Rodemos el Diálogo is a non-partisan civil society peace-building organization that began in London in 2012 when the negotiations started between the Santos government and the FARC guerrilla, among a group of Colombians and friends of Colombia who wanted to find a way to contribute to ending the Colombian armed conflicts in a negotiated and peaceful way. Since then, we have expanded our membership to several countries, mostly based in Colombia and the UK. We have more than 100 members, including also in the US, Canada, Spain, Slovenia, Mexico, and various other places. Most of us are volunteers, and we all join in a belief that through non-partisan support from civil society, it's really, this is an important way to contribute to ending the armed conflict, and also to build a culture of dialogue as part of what it means to build peace from civil society. And we discovered this culture of dialogue through hundreds of dialogues that we held in Colombia and the UK and around the world, to bring together Colombians and friends of Colombia from different walks of life with different political beliefs and different points of view and different life experiences, to try to talk about the difficult issues involved in ending the conflict and building peace. And along the way, we discovered 6 principles which we continue to use as our sort of guiding compass to help us navigate the difficulties of having dialogue. And we invite you to embrace those principles with us today. So I'll briefly run through all 6 of them. The first is respect, respect for the point of view, the time, the word of the other, understanding that we might all have different points of view and disagree with each other, but we can do so with respect for one another. Honesty is the second one. We're here today to share honestly our points of view without fear of being of having prejudice expressed against us for what we believe. Generosity is our third principle. We're here to try to give the best of ourselves for the space of the next 2 hours. Solidarity is a very important, our fourth principle. And of course, you know, all the time in our considerations of the conflict, we're always thinking about those who are suffering the conflict and how we can go out of our way to make an effort to end their suffering, but also putting ourselves in the shoes of the other, even if we disagree with that other. Fifthly, self-criticism. We believe that we come to dialogue with an open mind to be willing to change our points of view on some things if we should hear something that makes us revise our opinion. And sixthly, co-responsibility. We believe that not only none of us have all the answers, but actually we are all necessary. All of our actions and hands and words are necessary to build not only a better Colombia, but a better world. You can find out more about the work that we do at rodemoseldialogo.org. Our English site is uk.rodemoseldialogo.org, where you can find information about the different thematic teams that we have and the different thematic areas of work that we cover, from Truth Commission and transitional justice and reincorporation of the FARC, monitoring snapshots, regular monthly snapshots, and snapshots on the unit for the search of the disappeared, as well as analysis pieces and pedagogy work that we do in schools in Colombia, and various other activities as well. So I invite you to follow us on our website, on social media. Please bear in mind that this recording, this conversation is being recorded. I don't believe it's being live streamed, but It's being recorded for posterity, for our archives. And so if when you come to ask a question, you would prefer not to be recorded, please bear that in mind and maybe either keep your camera off or write your question in the chat box. But we do encourage you otherwise to be as participatory as you can and keep your camera on so that our wonderful speakers here today can see who they're interacting with rather than lots of black boxes. And also to ask your question in person if you feel able to do so, and you can do so. So without further ado, I think I will now hand over to Andrei, who will introduce our guests. I'm really, really excited for this conversation, and just to add finally my thanks personally to Kyle and Elizabeth for accepting this invitation. I'll let Andrei introduce you both, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us today. So thank you, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, Gwen, and it's brilliant to be here, and it's brilliant to have these two guest speakers. Really looking forward to it. I recently joined the Winchester Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and this is the first event that we are doing together, and really looking forward to many more events that make us think from England about the chances and possibilities of peace in Colombia and the hard work that we need to do for reconciliation. And we couldn't kick off this sort of partnership between Winchester Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace and Rodemos el Diálogo than with this incredible dialogue with Elizabeth from the International Crisis Group and Kyle Johnson, a very good friend who is in Fundación Core, Conflict Responses. They really have in-depth insight in Colombia. They keep working on this. I keep seeing their articles being published in different media platforms, in national media, and all these incredible reports written about the armed conflict in Colombia. So today is a fantastic opportunity for those of you who hadn't had the chance to talk to Elizabeth and to Kyle about this particular conflict in Colombia that we're going to focus today, that is the conflict with the ELN. Let me say that this is a really good, it's very timely, this event. Yesterday, the Unit of Investigation and Accusation of the HEP released the 4th report on the monitoring on risks. And one of the things that they show us is that the ELN is becoming one of those key actors in the conflict dynamics in the country. They even talk about 3 corridors, strategic corridors that the ELN is sort of consolidating. So having Kyle and Elizabeth here is great because, it will help us to understand that picture of the conflict dynamics, but also try to explore and brainstorm about, the possibilities for peace in Colombia. So as Gwen says, I think the event is not being live streamed, but it's being recorded. So we will put it online later on. But we really want to invite people to bear with us while we listen to our speakers and then drop their questions in the chat or turn on the camera and ask the question. So basically the structure of this event is the following. We are going to start with a semi-structured dialogue with Kyle and Elizabeth. We have been thinking about a couple of questions, and then this will take probably between 30 and 40 minutes maximum. We know that they will fulfill their word. This will not be like in Colombia that usually takes twice as long. And then we will open up the floor for Q&A, as I have suggested. We expect that to last for about 40 minutes. And then I will do some final remarks, and it takes us 5 minutes, and then we will wrap up and end this meeting. So we expect that will be done by 12:35 Colombia time, 5:35 UK time. So with that in mind, let's start. Kyle, why don't we start with you? And why don't you offer us a glance of the conflict dynamics with the ELN from the perspective of the research that you have been doing?
All right, sounds good. But first, thank you, Andrei and Rodemos, for the invitation to talk about this lesser known guerrilla in Colombia, a little bit of a niche guerrilla. But I mean, the first thing to start off is some basics about the ELN. Obviously, a regional, in Colombia, we call a regional guerrilla, right? It's not a threat to the national government. And to be honest, it doesn't really try to be a threat to the national government. I mean, it has a public discourse about overthrowing the government, or not even, it's not even that public, but every now and then you'll find in their documents that they talk about overthrowing the government and installing a socialist government in Colombia. But in reality, its plans do not reflect that whatsoever. It's much more regional guerrilla, looks to have this project of armed resistance. It's more about building power, what they call popular power on a local level, but really doesn't look to try to overthrow the national government. Every now and then, as occurred a couple of years back with the bomb in the police school here in Bogota, it will carry out some more larger politically motivated attacks. But again, it's not part of a sustained strategy to take over the government. So, but what we've also found is that since the end of the peace agreement, there's a discussion in Colombia of how much the ELN has strengthened or how much expanded. And so the ELN kind of expanded between the signing of the peace agreement, mainly actually really between, it goes even before the signing of the peace agreement, but up until about 2019, when it had nearly doubled the municipalities where it had some sort of presence. But that presence is very fragile. It's not a strong military presence. A lot of the time it's just political, kind of political activists that work for the ELN that get sent out there. And in many of those places, actually recently, and maybe in the last, let's say since the last year, let's say since 2020, it's been losing ground in a lot of those places where it was able to expand to. So in Cauca, for example, it had expanded from some niches in southern Cauca and central Cauca up into the north, but now it's no longer in the north. In Chocó, it had expanded up to Rio Sucio, Carmen del Darien, and even then it's been kind of beat back. Those are municipalities on the border with Panama. In Nariño, it tried to expand on the Pacific coast and again got beat back. In Caratumbo is maybe the only area where you can see a real sustained strengthening until now. There is a little bit of expansion into southern Cesar. This is all on the border with Venezuela. But again, they've gotten beat back again. So even their attempts at expansion were not even that sustainable, should we say. And even Pablo Beltran, the head negotiator for the ELN in Cuba, used to say, we don't have the people to do what people are saying we're doing in terms of expansion. Like, we just don't have the forces and don't have the finances. And it seems that at the time we all thought, well, there's a contradiction here, Pablo, but it seems like he was right. It's kind of the thing that it's just not, it's not really sustainable. And at the same time, within these expansion and when this new approach to kind of what is quote unquote post-agreement Colombia, a lot of that expansion is related to the drug trade. The ELN doesn't like to admit it. They don't like when you say it, but it is. It's in Caratumbo, and part of that has been being able to take control of areas and maintain control of the drug trade and participate directly in the drug trade, usually in all sorts of ways, whether it's controlling routes, whether it's providing loans to farmers so that they grow coca, whether it's just charging like taxes to drug traffickers, whatever it is. I mean, they control much of that border. They want to control all of that border with Venezuela, and there's economic gains to it. And that's a lesson that the ELN learned about 15 years ago, that originally the ELN was not involved in the drug trade for a very, very long time. But about 15 years ago, they learned that you can buy a lot of fancy guns and get a lot more recruits and win a lot more wars if you have a lot more money. And that has kind of allowed this internal blind eye to drug trafficking. Again, the ELN's documents talk about how they prohibit it and how it's bad for revolutionary causes and all that, but on the ground, it's kind of turning a blind eye and everyone kind of gets to do what they want. The last couple of things, last points before passing on to Elizabeth is one of the concerning things, or two of the concerning things, especially with the ELN, is that the ELN right now, the reason why they've lost ground in a lot of areas is because they're in conflict with other armed groups. In Cauca, they're in conflict with FARC dissidents. In southern Bolivar, they're in conflict with the Autodefensas Gaitanistas, like the Gulf Clan group. In Caratumbo, even though they're winning their conflicts, they're in conflicts with the Rastrojos and the EPL, even though that has kind of brought it down, has kind of limited intensity as of late. The same goes in Nariño. They're in a bit of a conflict, a very, very localized conflict with FARC dissidents. And in Chocó, obviously, with the Gulf Clan. The worrying thing about that is not only the humanitarian effects on the population, but the fact that the ELN, when it enters in conflict with other armed groups, has an anything goes approach. Literally, it's kind of, they throw the shackles off of how you should respect the local population, and literally any sort of violence to win that conflict is acceptable. It's an idea from Antonio Garcia, one of the leaders of the ELN. But that means they're much more willing to attack the civilian population. They're much less concerned if the civilians get killed, if they're confined, if the landmine blows off someone's leg, like occurred in Antioquia and Chocó not too long ago. They just any sort of concern, but they're big promoters of loving to say that they respect IHL, international humanitarian law, but once they enter into conflict with an unarmed group, they don't care about IHL anymore. And so that is extremely concerning in a lot of areas. And then finally, and I think probably Elizabeth could speak more to this as well, because the research, the information I have known comes from Crisis Group about their expansion into Venezuela. This is not new. In some areas, there's a whole familial policy that the ELN has carried out for 30 years of literally creating quote unquote families in the Venezuelan side of the border, but their expansion even farther into the mining arc and towards other areas is also extremely concerning, not only because of the finances and what that means, but the internal balance of power within the ELN and what that means for negotiations. But I will end there. I hope I stayed to 7 minutes, but feel free next time, just let me know, Andrei.
Kyle, that's amazing as usual. Fantastic. I guess you have given us a really good snapshot of, like what's happening in Colombia, but let's hear now, as you were suggesting, like similar sort of a snapshot from Elizabeth. So please, Elizabeth, tell us a bit about what you have seen on the ground.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I thought maybe it would be useful to discuss sort of the other actor in this equation, which is the state itself, and how it enters into conflict with the ELN and how that affects conflict dynamics on the ground. And because what we've seen, I think, in recent years, and as the conflict has fragmented, as Kyle highlighted, I think the areas where we've seen the highest levels of violence are actually the areas that are in conflict or contested territorial control. And that could be between two armed groups, or it can be between an armed group and the state, or it can be several, any combination of any of those. Often it's two armed groups and the state, all sort of going at each other. And I want to distinguish, when discussing about the sort of state's approach to addressing the ELN, I think we have to distinguish also between their effectiveness or their goal to weaken the organization as opposed to a goal to reduce conflict, because often those things are in very strong tension, right? So the things that the state is doing to disarticulate the armed group, as they like to say, often end up increasing the level of conflictivity at a local level. So what is the sort of strategy at the moment? Because negotiations are sort of basically off the table at the moment, it's a highly militarized approach. And the primary goal, again, really is to take this group apart, to disarticulate it and make it collapse in upon itself. The problem with this approach and the way that it's being executed is that they're using a model of counterinsurgency that was built around many years of fighting the FARC. The difference, of course, the FARC is a highly hierarchical organization. So if you take out key leaders of the FARC, it may in fact have an impact on the actual integrity of the organization. But as Kyle really well explained, the ELN, because it's so much more decentralized, this approach of decapitation and sort of kill capture strategy is much less effective, and frankly can have the unintended effect of atomizing both the organization and also the conflict on the ground itself. So I think the two key elements of sort of why this approach is backfiring is, again, first, because the ELN is not the FARC, but the approach the government is using is fairly similar to what they used for so many years. Second, because the conflict has fragmented so significantly, and we see this almost degradation of the organization into illegal economies, and also, frankly, sort of a watering down even of its initial I don't want to say ideological influence, but their willingness to work with partners on the ground who are clearly not of the same, not aligned with that thinking in a strict way. And what I'm talking about here are the alliances that they've made at local levels, particularly in sort of urban and near urban areas with more what we would call here sort of delinquent groups. So you sort of contract out these groups to sort of do some of the dirty work in urban areas and facilitate trafficking in and out. Now, the military approach to sort of kill and capture, what does it look like actually in practice? I think, first of all, the way that we've seen it executed is that the military has taken a very clear view of looking at the different fronts of ELN and finding those that are advantageous to attack. So often, this is something that I think we would raise significant concerns about. The fronts that have been advantageous to attack are those that are also in contest with another armed group. So, for example, in Cauca, where the ELN is in a direct conflict with FARC dissident fronts, in Choco, where there is a conflict between the ELN and the Gaitanistas. And what the military does in those cases is what they call going fishing in turned up waters. So basically, while these two armed groups are fighting each other, the military tries to take advantage of both of their weakness and distraction to sort of pick off, their enemies. The problem with this approach in practice is that it essentially requires the military to choose an enemy, right? So for example, in the case of Cauca, we have the ELN versus the FARC dissidents. And what the military did very specifically and intentionally was that our priority is the ELN. And because they've gone so strongly after the ELN, and the operations are largely geared towards them, it gave the community the impression that they were essentially letting the FARC dissidents enter the area. They were sort of facilitating their control over an area, because here you have, ELN versus FARC dissidents, military enters, only combats ELN. What else are you supposed to think? So often these unintended consequences can have really long-term detrimental effects in terms of the military's relationship with these communities. I think the other problem with the approach as it's been taken now is often these operations are sort of in and out. Right, so the military will go in and go after a very specific target within the ELN. When they're entering an area, they're not thinking about, let's control this municipality in a sort of holistic way. They're thinking about, there's this key commander in this area. We have 3 hours to get there. Let's go take him. We go in, we get out, and let what happens happen to the community. What this does is it essentially instrumentalizes the community from both sides. The military is essentially saying that the community doesn't matter. Their security is not the priority. The security is the apprehension of this suspect. From the other side, it gives the opportunity for the ELN to sort of take advantage of the community or instrumentalize them and essentially make them human shields. So in both cases, and for the fault of both of them, the civilians are in the middle, and you have these very nasty confrontations between the ELN and the military. I think this is one of the reasons that we can understand, or one of the ways that we can understand something that's been happening more and more frequently, which is that communities where the ELN has a presence on some level have told the military they no longer want any presence of the military at all. They have kicked the military out. And this isn't an indication that these communities are, they're all with the ELN. In fact, the opposite. In many cases, I think the level of coercion is very strong. But what it indicates is that the way that the military is going after this armed group is having unintended repercussions for their own security that are unmanageable for them. And so they would rather that the military just not attack the ELN, than to have them go about what they're doing in the current way. I think the last component of the government strategy at the moment that hasn't really been terribly effective, but it's worth mentioning because again, it is telling of the mentality that the real goal here is just to pick apart this organization and divide it, is a strategy of individual demobilizations. So last June, there was a big, there was a sort of a big media frenzy around this new decree that allowed individual fighters to demobilize. So rather than a group or through a process, you could have a group of 5 fighters and they could choose to demobilize. And so I think while that was sort of a positive step in that it gave more options for people who do want to leave these groups, it hasn't been terribly effective. And most of the demobilizations that we've seen from the ELN are essentially coerced. So for example, you will have an army operation where you have, 20 ELN supposed fighters who are captured, and they're essentially given an option. Would you like to go to jail, or would you like to individually demobilize? And it's sort of clear which one they're going to pick. But even despite those incentives, what we've seen actually in 2020 is that the number of individual demobilizations has gone down rather than increasing, despite this new legal mechanism that should theoretically facilitate more people abandoning the organization. So the last thing I want to say is really that I think, one of the things that is really poisonous about the current approach, and I would use that word because it really is a lasting effect, is because the military is taking an approach to, again, enter a community, kill, capture, carry out an operation, and then leave. What that produces is a stigma around the entire community that is in this area, that it has an ELN presence, that they are helenos, that they are somehow militia members, that they are somehow all criminalized. And that's very dangerous because it creates long-term obstacles, both to just generating basic security, but also for the state's ability to do all sorts of other things that they have promised to do from the peace accord with the FARC, whether it's rural development or this famous state presence. All those things become impossible when you have a stigmatization that runs so deeply. So let me stop there.
Great, Elizabeth. I really think is fantastic approach to look at the dynamics between the state and the ELN, and really complemented what Kyle was saying. I just have to say that now I'm deeply concerned because we are going to try to think about the possibilities of paving a negotiation with the ELN, and it's quite difficult from the picture that you both have presented to believe that it's possible to negotiate with a sort of very criminalized group. So I think you're going to have a hard time trying to convince us that there is a possibility of negotiating with the ELN. And, and for those of you who are in this meeting and don't know a lot about this, just to say that, in the current negotiation team, if you want to call it, of the ELN is now in Cuba because he was holding negotiations with the Colombian government until 2018. So there is one part of the ELN who are in Havana, Cuba, who are called the negotiation team. And they claim that they are an organization who is willing to negotiate with the Colombian state, and they are constantly asking for negotiations with the state. They have said that the state has betrayed the previous agreement that they had with the insurgency. And on the other side, you also have, in Colombia, what we have is some communities asking for humanitarian agreements, in particular in some of the ELN zones. And these people are also calling for negotiations with the ELN. So it's a complex picture, and, sort of painting that. Now, Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you this time. So with that in mind, is it possible to pave a way for negotiations with the ELN in the end, from now on until the end of 2021 and early 2022?
Yeah, so let me start, I guess, where we sort of left off with from the state's perspective, and I think their thinking on how or if to reopen negotiations is essentially that the ELN is welcome to negotiate their surrender, that they are welcome to submit and voluntarily demobilize and give up everything, and that would be great, and we're ready to talk about that anytime. So give us a call. And again, it's this thinking that the onus is on the ELN in terms of, again, the government's thinking about what to do. I think there was a really telling moment actually during the pandemic. At the very beginning of the pandemic last year, I believe it was in April, ELN declared a unilateral ceasefire. They did this for a month and it was quite effective. The following month, they said, let's do it again, but it has to be bilateral. And the government said, no, thank you. You're welcome to, put down your arms, but we will not be doing that. I think three main points about sort of the factors that complicate this, and then one grain of hope. So I think the first thing that complicates all of this is essentially that I think now, almost 5 years after the signing of the peace accord with the FARC, it is impossible to imagine a negotiation that would be so inclusive in terms of the themes that it covers with the ELN because of two reasons. First, because the accord with the FARC is so delayed. The perception of the ELN is that the FARC has essentially been, that the government has reneged on the accord, hasn't implemented it correctly. And so why would they sign an accord with the government if that's what happens when you sign an accord with the government? But the second reason, I think, really is that, at least in this government, there's really not a willingness to open that broad range of topics that range, all the way from the agricultural model, all the way up to sort of political reform. That appetite is just simply not there. So I think that, that sort of model, at least, is really quite impossible at the moment. I think the second point is this perpetual question about whether the ELN is divided. And on this matter, I think the government wants it both ways, because they want to argue that the ELN is so divided that it's impossible to negotiate with them. But at the same time, they're so strong that they're a transnational terrorist organization that can only be combated militarily, right? So in some ways, it's like pick your enemy here. Is the ELN so ferocious and hard to combat, or are they really atomized and very disconnected and weak? And I think that's a fundamental tension in the government's own understanding of the organization and its approach. And I think the last component that really complicates a return to negotiations is the issue of Venezuela. It's not just the fact that the ELN has a presence there. I think the main factor that complicates specifically returning to a negotiation with the ELN is that there is no international consensus about how to deal with Venezuela. And until you have some sort of understanding about how to deal with the political situation in Caracas, it's really very hard to understand how you could go about discussing the ELN and their presence along the border with the current status quo. So that is sort of, I think, just a real sort of macro level, realpolitik obstacle. So the sort of grain of hope I see in all of that is that to end this conflict, you have to negotiate with the ELN. And that is the hope, because you have to talk to them if you want this to end. And we've seen the clamor from communities themselves demanding this. And I think, the empowerment of civil society has been a real, a very strong effect of the peace accord and the ability to speak up and demand these things. And I think it will become impossible to ignore, particularly as the humanitarian situation, is really quite obvious to all. In a place like Chocó, where the community is almost uniformly, in support of some sort of agreement on a humanitarian level, it's very hard to say that, no, you shouldn't have that agreement, because it's so clear what the benefits would be for everyone.
Great, Elizabeth. I think that, and there are other organizations in other regions also calling for those humanitarian agreements, but I think that you have a fantastic, at least the grain of hope. I think Kyle has something to work with in order to take it even beyond that. So Kyle, over to you. What is the way forward to negotiate with the ELN?
Look, I'll be very frank. I think the way forward to negotiate with the ELN is forget about the Duque government. Just forget it. The Duque government really, they had, obviously we had kind of like a no negotiation going on, but the last nail in the coffin was the US putting Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, in part because of pressure, kind of an alliance, should we say, from the Colombian government and the Colombian government's unwillingness to recognize the protocols that would, at the end of the negotiation, take the ELN team out of Cuba. Not recognizing those protocols and trying to putting Cuba and Norway in a very difficult situation meant that those ELN negotiators are still in Cuba, like you mentioned, which then served the base for the state sponsor of terrorism charge. That is just, and you did that with, the relationship with Cuba and the ELN, it's like one of those old couples that had 90 years old that you see in the park that still hold hands. This is, the ELN basically was kind of thought of by the different Castro Ramirez, the Vasquez Castro brothers in Cuba. This is a very close relationship, even though Cuba is not happy that the ELN is still there. The relationship is still very strong in terms from the ELN perspective towards Cuba. And so that just put the nail in the coffin. At the same time, as Glenn mentioned, as Elizabeth mentioned, there's still the government is saying, yeah, you guys can surrender, feel free to surrender. And the strange thing about the negotiation with the ELN was our glimmer of hope within the Duque government was Álvaro Uribe. Because Álvaro Uribe still believed, to a certain extent, that you could negotiate with the ELN. And he did attempt it during his government at least twice. But Uribe, just the other day, reiterated those conditions that Elizabeth had mentioned, those just surrender. Don't do any criminal activity, give us your guns, concentrate, and we're fine. And it's just, that is not going to work. So when we lose, it's very strange, but if you lose Uribe on this issue, it's very hard to find another ally in the government that would be willing to step up at this point. I think the best approach right now would be to think about the next government, but we can't be naive there. For the ELN, is much more important to get concessions from an Uribista government than to get concessions from a Petro government. I mean, how can you show that you've forced your enemy to negotiate with you and take your concessions and change everything if it's someone who's ideologically has a similar viewpoint on things? That is just, it's just not that powerful of a negotiation. So the next approach is the next government. And I'd also like to touch on this idea about the ELN being divided internally. Very quickly, I don't think the ELN is divided internally, but there's an analyst here who knows the ELN very well, who I think states it the best. And he just says, in the stock market within the ELN, unity is worth more than peace. So if in order to stay united as one ELN, the cost is a peace negotiation, the ELN will go with unity. That's it's just how they work because of their history and how of mainly the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, even the 90s. Okay, their whole history, there's a lot of division in the ELN. Let's just put it that way. And so that is always going to be, but the idea that the government comes up and says, as Elizabeth mentioned, it's exactly how the government sees the ELN is as this kind of fragmented, chaotic internal group with a lot of fighting. That's just also not necessarily the case. But the government is not willing to move the correct levers they need to maintain the ELN united in a negotiation situation. They're just not willing to. And they're not easy nonetheless, to be quite honest. But I'd also like to propose a situation, a scenario. Let's say at the end of this year, there's some sort of, or maybe in September this year, there's some sort of, the parties start talking again, right? And the parties start talking, and this leads to an idea that they could probably reinitiate the negotiations. The confidence between the two sides is so almost irreparably damaged. It's just so damaged that what would that negotiation look like? I think it would be a year or whatever's left of the government, depending in our hypothetical scenario, of finger pointing and attempts at finding confidence building measures that simply won't go anywhere because they're extremely, extremely fragile. Extremely fragile. The ELN sees this government as a genocide committing government. I mean, from that point of view, it's hard to see. And plus, like what I mentioned about Cuba, it's very hard to see how they could do it. How you could get beyond to a point where, because we do have an agenda, the government doesn't like it, but we have one. There is some confidence building measures that existed up until this point, the ceasefires, even though they weren't perfect and we couldn't get a second ceasefire, bilateral ceasefire. The meetings in Tocancipá with civil society is very important. And I think that kind of stuff, we wouldn't get to that kind of stuff within this government. And so even if they built confidence with the Duque government, by the time that would be done, we'd have a new government. So it's a very just difficult scenario for me in this moment moving forward. What I do, and I completely agree with Elizabeth, and I think the key here is some sort of regional agreements. In Chocó, we had a very, very civil society based, a whole infrastructure in civil society based for the Acuerdo Humanitario Ya. In Calatumbo, there's been also pushes for it as well. In Cauca, at least with the people I've talked to in Argelia and El Tambo, where the conflict, the ELN dissidence is the hardest. There's just so much fear right now that no one really wants to step out and propose like an agreement, even though I think they would all be very happy with an agreement. I think that's where it's at, because the fact that the ELN is so decentralized and a lot of decision-making, to a certain extent, a lot of decision-making occurs on a regional level, it makes sense that pressuring on the regional level from bottom up instead of top down is probably something that could have a much better effect than waiting for the government to say, okay, you don't have to surrender, we'll talk about something. And I think that that's going to be key also because, and I'll close with this, the leaders of the ELN in Cuba are kind of their most pro-peace leaders, right? They're the guys who've historically have been in peace talks. Pablo Beltran has been in like every attempt at a peace talk or exploratory negotiation ever, basically. Not all of them, but still, like the majority. Gabino, who's in theory the head of the ELN, its oldest member, its founding member, but who's losing respect, is also in Cuba. And then a bunch of people from the Dirección Nacional, the national direction, are there, but the skeptics are still in the field. And the fact that the skeptics are often in the field, it just means that, and this is a natural process, I don't think the ELN could do anything to avoid it, is that the kind of, and I hate simplifying like this, but I'm going to simplify, the pro-peace kind of side of the ELN is losing influence, it's losing ground, and it's losing legitimacy over the ELN in the field. Even the units that have historically been close to Pablo Beltran and Gabino, we're starting to see a sway kind of away from them and how they talk and how they present what they do and their kind of approach to the conflict. It's an oversimplification, but nonetheless, it's a challenge. And so I think from bottom, getting those units in the field that are now increasingly closer to the kind of anti-peace part of the ELN, pushing them to become a bit more pro-peace from the bottom up, calling their bluff on the idea of representing communities, I think is essential to move forward. And I think that's quite possible. Not, like I said, the conditions aren't there everywhere, but I think that for me is the best way, is pressuring the ELN from bottom up while basically wait for a government change. I don't think there's, I hate to say it, I'm gonna be very, very frank. I wouldn't waste my time trying to convince the Duque government to negotiate with the ELN. I wouldn't waste my time getting them to try to change the conditions that they are imposing on the ELN. They haven't budged in 3 years, and I think they're misreading the situation. They believe, as Elizabeth mentioned, they believe the onus is on the ELN after the car bomb here in Bogota. But by not recognizing the protocols established with the Norwegians and the Cubans for the end of negotiation scenario, actually the ball, I believe, is back in the government's court. I think the government is misreading the situation terribly, and that just really doesn't help. But I'll end there with a little bit of hope.
Amazing. That's really good somehow. I mean, I really, this is the moment where we're gonna open up the floor for questions and comments by the audience. Really have, I'm gonna put two things there for you to reflect later on after we have heard, because I see that Dudley is willing to make a comment, and I really want to invite the rest of the people here to either put their hand up so that I can also give you a chance to ask a question, or to show me in the chat box that you wanna also ask a question, and then I'll just give you the chance to do so. But of the things that Kyle has said, I mean, and I wonder whether Elizabeth could react to these two things that I'm gonna say too, is first thing, this idea that the ELN is more willing to negotiate with an Uribista government than with Petro. I mean, that's quite interesting with a leftist government. And if Petro is gonna win in 2022, I mean, why would that be the case? Probably they would achieve more structural reforms with someone who is more pro, social movements. I mean, and then the other thing that I was just thinking that is quite important that we haven't discussed is the role of Biden. If with Biden, there is something that we should also take into account into this equation. But let me just leave them as something that you can, take stock on, and let's open the floor for at least 2 or 3 questions or comments from the floor. So Dudley, please, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Andrei. And first of all, thank you very much to both the speakers. Brilliant, both cases. I thought really very interesting and very illuminating. I'd just like to endorse 2 or 3 of the points made on the basis of rather dated experience I had of talks with the ELN between 2016, 2018, when I sat in on the government's negotiating team planning for these meetings. I think a great opportunity was lost in those years because the approach of the government, I think, was misguided under Juan Camilo Restrepo and far too influenced by the elections under when Gustavo Bell was in charge, and they were referring all the time to what Duque wanted. So I think, unfortunately, for those reasons, we lost 2 years when there was an opportunity to engage the ELN. Having said that, it's far more difficult in my recollection, and indeed I've always assumed this, but it was proved to be the case, far more difficult to negotiate with the ELN than with the FARC. The FARC were a very Stalinist group of negotiators. Once they agreed, that was it, they agreed. With the ELN, there was much more uncertainty. You were never sure whether the people sitting at the table could deliver on what they were saying. There was far more reference back to the leadership in exile. And indeed, there was a difficulty with communication with people like Pablito, who was known to be opposed to the talks and was operating on the Venezuelan border. So that was a problem. They are really very difficult people to negotiate with. On the question of Uribe, I recall what a senior Israeli said to me 20 years ago at the time of the Oslo talks: you negotiate with your enemies, not your friends. And if you really want a deal, you have to get a deal with the people you're at war with or in conflict with. Then you can deliver the deal. If you talk to your friends, you leave at the side the people who don't believe in the deal. So you have to bring them in, the ones who are skeptical. So personally, although I have my own reservations about Uribe, should we say, I think that makes a lot of sense. If you want to get a deal with the ELN, you have to get those kind of people around the table. The Venezuelan factor, I think, is crucial. That has made a huge difference. The fact that the ELN can go backwards and forwards across the border, that they've had the tacit support of successive Venezuelan governments for 20 years. And in fact, to a certain extent, they themselves administer part of the territory on that side of the border. And finally, I think the drugs trafficking, I completely agree. I mean, whether they like to admit it or not, this is an organization that has, in military terms, survived because of drugs trafficking. I'm not saying it survived politically, that's far from the case. I think politically they're talking about a very different issue, but just in terms of the cost of maintaining armed conflict, drugs has been absolutely crucial. And whether they like it or not. And my own recommendation, for what it's worth, which is nothing probably, to the Santos government was start with local politics, start from below, get the communities involved, have local deals, local agreements, and move up from there, move up nationally. Don't start from the other end of the spectrum. So sorry, I've spoken too long, but there we are.
Amazing, as always, Dudley, amazing to have you here, really. I mean, your insights always so useful. Makes me think of some of the initiatives that some of the communities are doing also in Nariño. I don't know if you're aware of that, but in Samaniego and the Agua communities trying to move things forward with the ELN on a bilateral basis, because this has worked in the past. But let's see what happens in the future. So Camilo, I saw that you were the second person to say that wanted to ask a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Andrei. I have a comment on the question. The first comment was, I really agree with Elizabeth regarding the government, but that is a huge, like a huge gamble in a sense, because of course, only Nixon could go to China, and if with Santos, the FARC agreement was deemed as inappropriately communist, then with Petro or with someone from the Green Party, it would be a disaster trying to get it through to half the society that doesn't believe in negotiations. But then there's also the fact that there's no other option out to so many of the crises if it's not radically changing the government. So that has a, that is a very difficult gamble. And my question was regarding Biden and particularly Cuba, because the visit of the Obama government to Cuba in 2016 was also a visit to the negotiating table, and John Kerry met with both FARC and government delegations in Cuba. To what extent could a change of policy of Biden regarding Cuba affect the chances of getting the negotiation out at some point?
Thanks, Camilo. And then I had in the list, from what I could see, Bettina.
Good afternoon, everyone from London. Good morning to everyone on the other side of the world. Firstly, thank you to both Elizabeth and Kyle for your presentations and comments. It's been really interesting to hear. My question is more oriented around the whole presence of the ELN in Venezuela and understanding this as a factor that needs to be taken into consideration in prospective solutions or ways of addressing the conflict. How do you see the presence of the ELN in Venezuela as impacting the willingness of the ELN to sit down and negotiate or even, demobilize? And how would you see, or what do you think is the most effective way of countering this or addressing this issue? If it's through regional agreements, as we previously discussed, that have been appearing in Colombia, or does it require a different approach considering the tacit support, as Dudley has mentioned, and as is quite commonly known, that the government of Venezuela is currently providing to the ELN? Thank you very much.
Brilliant. So why don't we, sort of come back to the main table here to hear some responses and reflections on these topics, and then we do a second round of questions and comments, and I invite other people to also start putting their hands up. We already have some, but let's go from here. So I think we finished with Kyle. So shall we start with Elizabeth this time?
Okay, sure. I'll touch on a few. So the issue of Uribe, I think, Dudley, you answered this perfectly, but it's not only that the ELN would want to negotiate with their fiercest enemy, it's also that from the sort of like right-wing perspective politically, Uribe is one of the only people who would have the credibility to make an agreement and convince that constituency that it wasn't a capitulation, right? So you have to have both of those sort of political factors. So it has to convince the ELN that, that they're winning concessions from their enemies, but you'd have to have someone like Uribe who could also convince his supporters that he isn't giving concessions, right? And that has to be a singular figure that is in that role, that is someone like him. And that's one of the reasons that it's such a tragedy that the negotiations fell apart under this government, because it was actually an opportunity. With regard to the Biden administration, look, I think, these are very early days for the Biden administration. They have been extremely preoccupied with the situation on their southern border. So I think it's pretty early to say if we're going to see shifts, major shifts, any shifts in policy. We get a sense that there's a change in tone, at least on Colombia, to focus more on sort of some of the structural issues that are behind the conflict. On Venezuela, it's sort of a whole nother can of worms. And I think one of the challenges on Venezuela, again, is first the lack of international consensus that the US could sort of align with, but also I think the lack of good options. And here, I think the thinking for the Biden administration is probably going to be damage control more than anything else. But I think it's actually probably a little bit too early to say exactly what we might see. The issue of Venezuela and the ELN. So I think one of the things that's I think important to keep in mind in this context is that there is currently no communication between Bogota and Caracas. What does that mean? That means that this chaotic border where you have both sides militaries, you have the ELN, you have FARC dissidents, you have post-paramilitary groups, the risks for confrontation between any range of those actors are extremely high, as we've seen this week, because there's been extremely strong clashes between the Venezuelan armed forces and a front of the FARC dissidents, the Frente 10. This is sort of an example of how this very chaotic mix can escalate in a way that's unanticipated, and how both capitals really have no way to walk it back. So why is this important in the context of the ELN? It's sort of assumed that the ELN in a scenario such as that would side generally with the Venezuelan government. And let's be clear, this is not new. I think there's a lot of sort of exaggeration of the ELN's presence in Venezuela in the sense that in thinking that it's something novel, something that's changed since the peace agreement. No, it's not. It's been reinforced, and perhaps they've won a few more illicit rents, but it's not a new factor, politically for them or for either government. So I raise this point because I think, one of the unexpected sort of black swan events that we can imagine is some sort of real escalation on the border that would draw in Colombian armed groups, the ELN, and both countries' militaries. And that is a scenario that I think we should all keep in the back of our minds, because it could contaminate any attempts to sort of reinvigorate a political process. And it also just complicates any initiation of a political process, because how do you even go about discussing this group that has a presence on both sides of the border if you have absolutely no way to talk one capital to another about what's going on? So that would be sort of a first step almost to resolve some of the regional disputes, is reopening in some level that communication. It used to be that generals along the border or brigade commanders or whatever could sort of call one another, the Venezuelan to the Colombian to the Venezuelan, give them a heads up, we're going to do this operation, so that it wouldn't escalate like that. And that's been stopped. And that's actually more recent than the sort of high level communication that's broken down. But it's very important, and actually reinitiating that local communication could be one of the key steps, at least, to de-escalate the border situation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Kyle, you wanna have a go?
Sure. I mean, Elizabeth covered the bases extremely well. I completely agree on Biden. It's too early. The House of Representatives has asked Biden to change Cuba policy and go back to Obama's policy, et cetera. But I mean, it's just too early to tell. It's not. And to be quite, and as Elizabeth mentioned, to be quite honest, policy vis-a-vis Cuba is not on the top of the Biden list of concerns at the moment. Even in foreign policy, not only in just policy in general, but also in foreign policy in general. Though there is some promise if Biden is going to fulfill his promise and kind of things are going to go back to normal, which is Obama normal, obviously. There is some hope there because a lot of Cuba was extremely concerned and has been pushing to keep Venezuela as a Maduro regime in power, in part because they believed that they were next, right? And they were correct in that belief. They were next. But without that concern, it's possible that Cuba itself also changes policy and changes position, or at least not change radically, but adjust its position vis-a-vis Venezuela or vis-a-vis the region in general, which also could be useful. But I want to dive in. I want to say first, it feels really good when someone like Dudley reiterates points that you've made, because like I say, when someone with that experience comes in and kind of has the same viewpoint, I feel, okay, we've hit the nail on the head a little bit here. But Venezuela, I think we have to, the view of Venezuela the ELN in Venezuela has to be more complex than what it is been somewhat discussed, at least in the Colombian media. It's not just a place to make money. It's much more than that. First, and also, what does it matter if it's a place to make money? It's not only to maintain the war, as Dudley mentioned, but it's also who's making that money. And so the fact that someone like Pablito and Antonio are making a lot of money and using that money to gain influence over the rest of the ELN, that's what matters. I think the money is not only they have more money for war, of course, but the fact that they gain that power. I mean, think about Pablito. So Pablito was broken out of a Colombian prison in a movie-style operation in 2009 on the border with Arauca. And at the end of 2014, he was the head of masas, or the head of political movements in the COSE, in the leadership of the ELN, within 5, almost 6 years. Someone with an extreme amount of power. And by the way, he got voted into that position. So and understanding about what that means, that Pablo, who also rebuilt the Western war front in Chocó, basically, so there's an ally, can use this to try to kind of increase his influence over the rest of the ELN, which is a group that has been hit pretty hard financially in some parts of the country. That for me is one of the telling things. It's who is, whether we like it or not, I think there's a lot of personal relationships within ELN units and its leadership, the central command. I think that's key. So I think Venezuela is also important for that. It's not an end in of itself, but it's a means to an end. And then lastly, there's a couple other things. I believe the ELN wants to control the whole of the Venezuelan border to be able to strengthen its negotiating position vis-a-vis the Venezuelan government. It has a pretty good negotiating position. It has some good allies in the government who can, in a question of days, can just lose their position of power, right? I mean, it's not like the leadership in the Venezuelan government is the most stable government, stable thing on the planet. But I think that's part of it as well. And there's a last idea that I would like to research more within the ELN, but it's the idea of being a vanguard guerrilla group. This old idea of the regional Latin American fighters, kind of like Che Guevara, very Cuban viewpoint of how to run a guerrilla war. I still think that idea, even though the ELN says it's not dead, I think that idea is still alive in some of the leadership in the ELN. I don't think it's completely dead. And that's extremely important if you're a guerrilla, if you want to be a regional vanguard guerrilla, to be not only fighting in Colombia, but fighting for the liberation of all of Latin America, you know? And there's always this rumor that some Venezuelan officials had told Antonio Garcia that he could be the next Che Guevara, and that Antonio believed it, and that it was always a rumor, but it's kind of always based the idea that Venezuela is not just about, I mean, it's a very pragmatic relationship, obviously. It's a very political relationship more than anything. There's a lot of local elements to it, as Elizabeth mentioned. I think we have to remember there's a lot of local elements to this relationship, but it goes beyond just money, and it goes beyond just a hiding place to be. I think it really touches on some very deeply ingrained political ideas in the ELN, and a little bit of deeply ingrained political ideas in some of the most radical elements of the Venezuelan government. But what will be interesting is I think there's two efforts, and I'm going to name drop the U.S. Institute for Peace. I don't know if this is okay to name drop them, but in one of the things that in dialogues that I had with the Venezuelan opposition, just because of through the U.S. Institute for Peace, was that the Venezuelan opposition was saying we need a negotiation with the ELN, because if we come to power, what are we going to do with these people? The Venezuelan government or the Venezuelan opposition has said that it would come to power and pay for things based off oil revenue, right? With an oil infrastructure that is just ridiculous. I mean, it's just not operating at all. But also, we should remember that the ELN are experts in blowing up oil infrastructure. So if the ELN were to take a more active approach in a Venezuelan opposition government scenario because it finds itself under threat, I imagine the first thing that it would do would be to blow up oil infrastructure. So adding the Venezuelan, the political elements to it, if there is some sort of move forward, if there is some sort of transitional government elections, whatever happens, and Elizabeth will know much more about this than me. But in a scenario where we have an opposition government coming back to power, trying to rebuild the state, they're not going to have the capacity to deal with the ELN. It's just that simple. And so I don't like to think that the negotiations depend on Venezuela to move forward, but we should also think that the Venezuelan scenario for the ELN is not always a positive one, and their role could change depending on the scenario we see in the future. But and how can we address it? I'm going to go back to Andrei for that one.
That's fantastic, Kyle. I really think you have brought back the ideological dispute here, and which is really interesting, and also this new element of the pipelines in Venezuela, I think, is something that we hadn't necessarily considered. Okay, so with this in mind, let's go back to our audience. Cesar Amaya.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and for the wonderful comments you've made. I have a small question because I think I totally agree with both of you, Elizabeth and Kyle, what you have said. I'm totally in this line. I also agree with Kyle's idea that he said that it's probably a waste of time to try to convince this government to negotiate with the ELN. Yeah, this is like this very well-known situation. Like it's not me, it's you. Yeah, I mean it's not you, it's me. So they never do like a another step forward. So we have probably elections in 2 years time. Some people say that probably the solution is to extend for 2 years the period of the president. I don't think that's a good idea. Also to convince him. But how do you see this political, economical, and social scenario in 2 years, given the current dynamics of the guerrilla and the violence in different regions? Yeah, and also the crisis provoked by the pandemic, because I think, for example, there is a chance of the historical pact that is going on now, that probably left-wing or progressist government could win the elections. Yeah, let's imagine that it could happen. They will get a very broken state, politically, economical, and social, I think. So it will be a very, very hard thing. How do you see these possible different scenarios in 2 years? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Cesar. Let's just remember that it's less than 2 years. It's year and 2 months. I think we're a year away from elections. If they don't extend that's
so they probably need 2 years more. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Luckily.
Andrés, the newest member of Rodemos el Diálogo, please come in and ask your comment or make your question.
Thank you, Andrei, and thank you, Elizabeth and Kyle, for your interventions. Like Kyle has suggested this idea of like bottom-up negotiations, like more locally focused, and Dudley has agreed on that. But I'm struggling a little bit on picturing it, and particularly would like to ask you, like, what should be the role of local administrations in those possible bottom-up negotiations? Because in many cases, I remember like mayors or governors claiming that they actually had no tools to actually sit down with the groups and try to pursue a negotiation. I guess that any sort of bottom-up negotiation would still require some sort of like institutionalization of the agreements. So how can local administrations fit into that idea? And the second question would be, but maybe this one is too broad, but like, should those negotiations actually should expand its scope a little bit to cover and include other local armed groups? Because I guess that as soon as the ELN enters into a negotiation, they would constantly be looking at the threats that those negotiations could actually represent in the field if other local armed actors continue to dispute their territories, as it's happening in the western coast, or like everywhere, as you pointed out before.
That's a very good point, Andres. And actually, we have been talking to some people in the regions who have started to suggest something along those lines. It would be very interesting to hear from you response to that. The next question has been written on the chat by Borja Palladini. But Borja, it's fantastic to have you here, and I would love to hear your voice. So would you like to just turn your microphone on and ask the question yourself?
No, it's thank you, Andrei, and thank you, Kai, Elizabeth, for your words. It's just several voices has expressed the importance of a bottom-up peace process, but to the best of my understanding, this is something that we need to think about how to do that. We agree that the traditional, exclusive, top-down, only men peace process, it's what is going on. It's what we know how we know how we know how to do that. At least there is a lot of experiences, but we know that there are a lot of limits. And I think here in the ELN peace process, probably in some parts of in Philippines, there are some movements that are asking for a different type of peace process. But to the best of my understanding, there are not many examples around. Then it's a field for innovation, a field for thinking anew of what to do or how to do that. The question is, what are the possibilities for a more innovative, inclusive, and participatory bottom-up peace process in Colombia?
Fantastic. I'll just add the footnote. If probably Petro would be more tempted to do this innovative approach to peace processes, guys, because you need to have a different view from government. But who knows? I mean, let's go to, thank you, Borja, and then let's go to Gwen. I think, you know, because of the time, I'm going to collect the final comments and then I get back to you and then we start wrapping up after your responses. So Gwen, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your comments. Really, really interesting presentations. Maybe slightly building from Borja's question, I remain rather skeptical about very participatory bottom-up peace processes because of the kind of the possibility that it becomes too open-ended and too broad, but thinking a little bit also about the experiences so far of local negotiated humanitarian agreements, thinking in the future about potential negotiations, whether kind of bottom-up or bottom-up and top-down. What are the actors that could play a sort of positive role as brokers and facilitators? And I see that Jorge has written in the chat about the Catholic Church. I know that there are examples of local church groups doing important brokering style work at a local level, but also maybe an actor like the Pope and the Vatican, a sort of top-down figure. I know that the liberation theology origins of the ELN might mean that such a figure would have a positive influence, but also perhaps rather tenuous connection to liberation theology continues today among the majority of the ELN, or whether there are any other organizations that you would consider that would be important to be able to actually make local negotiations manageable, civil society organizations and international organizations maybe, and how would such dialogues take place, and who could have an influence on the ELN or, you know, if there was a favorable government and all other things being favorable, who could influence the ELN and encourage them to negotiate? Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. And I think you have included Eduardo's comment there, so I'm going to skip him. And Dudley has asked me to make one final comment before getting back to you guys. And I think we all would be interested to hear that final comment. So Dudley, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Very quickly. I had the same conversation with the Venezuelan opposition about 5 years ago when we hosted a meeting between the government and the opposition in Aruba. And they made exactly the same point to me about the ELN, that the ELN will be capable of sabotaging the oil industry inside Venezuela unless they were able to reach some sort of settlement, that they were genuinely concerned about the fact that the ELN controlled territory and was in that position. Personally, I think there'll only be a realistic chance of a peace settlement that might deliver if you had a change of regime in Caracas and a change of government in Bogota. I had a very dispiriting conversation with the peace commissioner about 2 years ago when it was obvious that they were just not interested in talks. They were interested in what they called surrender, as Kyle said. If I recall correctly, Pablito was jailed in the first instance because he was betrayed by Antonio Garcia. So, I mean, good ELN solidarity there. I think I also agree about the Guevara dream. I think some of the ELN subconsciously or indeed consciously in many cases, are still driven in part by this vision of the old 1960s, 1970s Latin American revolution. I think it is part of their makeup, along with liberation theology and so on. So, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dudley. Okay, so let's go back, and this time let's start with Kyle to hear his thoughts. Kyle, over to you.
All right, so there's a lot going on here. I mean, the current political economic situation the next year, whatever. Look, I mean, I cannot see how Centro Democrático can win the next elections on its own. It has to ally, it has to create alliances, and it's already doing that with other parties. I mean, it's just too bureaucratically weak. It's too politically weak. No one's happy with it. It's just, and on a security kind of, as a pro-security government, let's say, it's done a terrible job. So, I mean, it's just looking where it can come, which would probably mean that I would agree. I think a leftist government has a chance right now. It has a chance. I wouldn't say it would win, but it has a good chance if it creates an argument of, we won't make the same mistakes as the Duque government kind of thing. I think anyone who can disconnect themselves from Duque has a chance. It's terrible to say it, but it's just, unfortunately, his political reality is so weak. So I mean, what that could mean is that there's space for a push for to restart negotiations with the ELN under the current kind of protocol model that exists. Simply because I think there's a lot of people who are desperate about the security issue, and the ELN is obviously very connected to that. But also just because of, like I say, the opportunity for a leftist government, I think is just so, helps. And also I think there's a sensation a bit, and I don't know what everyone else in this meeting feels, but I think looking at civil society, I feel that there's a bit of sensation that this is kind of like a now or never scenario in terms of this negotiation. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I think there's a feeling with that it's we got to put it on the table now. It's got to be on the agenda of the next government, or we'll lose another huge opportunity, which is true, which is definitely true. But I think that is actually plays in our favor to try to get a negotiation within the current political context of just an extremely weak Duque government. I think an increasingly weak right wing in Colombia doesn't mean it's weaker than the left, but it's weaker than it was 3 years ago is what I mean. And then bottom up negotiations, local administrations. I mean, that's very difficult because I think a lot of local administrations, one, would want to participate, but have a little bit of, they can't just full on participate. They have legal restrictions, first off. And recent experience in Medellin with an attempt of a negotiation with the Oficina Migao, if I'm not mistaken, and a member of the Medellin's office, mayor's office, ended up with that public employee in jail. Sorry, there's an ambulance going by, but that person ended up in jail. So, I mean, I think a lot of administrations, I think what they would do is, I think the best role for them that is realistic would be a little bit of behind the scenes, not directly at the table. I mean, I think I would agree that the idea of the institutionalization of the agreement depends on what's in the agreement. So if we come to an agreement on a humanitarian issue, the role of local institutions will be very limited, let's say. Probably just issues of what the role is in terms of gaining humanitarian aid and access and things like that. If you get a larger agreement, which I don't see as possible, then the institutions might play a role because they might actually have to, sit at the table with local civil society about a certain policy. I think that's going to be very, very dependent on what we're trying to achieve on a local level. And my feeling is that the first thing to go with to try to get with the ELN would be humanitarian agreements. And that gets to your second question, Andres, which is, should they include other armed groups? If it's a humanitarian agreement, yes. No other way. I mean, these are in scenarios where there's disputes between other groups. In Caratumbo, some of the under the radar negotiations to lower the intensity of the conflict included both ELN and EPL. The ceasefire in Tumaco included both, actually 3 armed groups. In Chocó, el Acuerdo Humanitario Ya actually was an agreement that was proposed to both the ELN and the Clan del Golfo, but the focus was mainly on the ELN because simply there was access and response. The Clan del Golfo didn't really do or say anything. But I think it's a very good point that you make, Andres, about the ELN's concerns about who gets their, quote unquote, their territory after a peace agreement. And this is one of the areas of resistance. So in Chocó, obviously there's a lot of resistance to a peace agreement, but part of it, and not all of it by any sense of the word, but part of it is definitely the concern that they hand over their weapons or do whatever, and then Chocó just gets filled with what they call paramilitaries. The same thing in Southern Bolivar, and probably the same thing in Cauca, but I mean, that unit of the ELN in Cauca is so, we'll just leave them there. They're just so unique. But that is a serious concern. I'll put it that way. That is a serious concern. And that if the local negotiations, if it's humanitarian, yes. If it's more political, maybe not, because it depends on what you negotiate. If you want to negotiate end to a conflict between the ELN, the EPL, and Calatumbo is one thing. If you want to negotiate that there's a decreased intensity in conflict, that's another thing. If you want to negotiate demining, like has occurred in other areas, then maybe you don't need to bring the EPL to that negotiation, right? So I think it's a bad answer to your question that the answer is depends, right? That's the worst answer you can give. I think with Borja's question and the whole bottom-up issue, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I would agree with Glenn that could just be way too open-ended and broad. That is definitely a risk. The joke is that the ELN wants to negotiate only 3 things, nothing else, which is the political, the economic, and the social. That's it. So, I mean, there's always a risk there just because the ELN's at the table, right? But I think what I would do, thinking about the bottom-up negotiations, is realize we don't have to start from zero necessarily. And that's because, one, we have previous experience with these bottom-up, with the ELN specifically. But we also have an agenda with the ELN that, if it is adjusted correctly or applied correctly, could be very bottom-up. And I think that's, in fact, what the ELN wanted. The problem is that that agenda is it's not that useful, and it's extremely prone to just be these long-ended, long-winded, too broad talks. That is definitely a risk. So I think we would have to put in that agenda, whether we like it or not, there would have to be some issues defined. What's going to be on the table? And then perhaps go bottom up from there. But I'd also like to mention that the Mennonite Church in Arauca, about 6 or 7 years ago, was able to bring everyone basically to the table to a meeting in Cundinamarca. And we're talking oil companies, and then the social organizations, and how do I put this? The social organizations that the ELN believes are theirs. Let's put it that way. And everyone in the middle. They got them to the table to have meetings and discussions and talk about the issue of oil and social policy in Arauca. We're not starting from scratch. I think that is one of the keys. And I think it's useful to look at these experiences, find what worked, find what didn't work, and try to apply it to a certain, the context of whatever can be, because I agree. I think I agree with Borja. We don't know what it looks like. I think it's one of those issues that we can't define perfectly now, but we know it when we see it. But I would also say that we have some migas, as we say in Spanish, we got a little something that we can start with that will help us kind of build on that. We don't have to start from scratch. With the church, I would just mention that the church on a local level is fundamental. It's key. If you remember the weak bilateral ceasefire between the government and the ELN in the Santos administration, the UN mission was verifying verified that ceasefire and will never do it again. They're just not an option. But also the church was there. So that I think that's key. I don't think the Pope is the best option, because what I understand is that Italy is one of these countries that is accompanying the negotiation, just because the church in the Vatican said we don't want to do it. So the Vatican didn't want to do it, so Italy kind of got it, just because of geographic proximity. But so I'm not sure the church in Vatican is on the table. But they would definitely influence the ELN, because I think, and finally, I'll close here. I think a lot about influencing the ELN is calling their bluffs. And you see this with their discourse. So if their discourse is all about defending civil society at the negotiation table, okay, then let's have a participatory process and see if you guys actually want to defend them. Because there's a lot of issues between civil society and the ELN right now. There's a lot of problems about who the ELN listens to, and Andrei knows this better than anyone here, I think, but who the ELN listens to and who doesn't listen to. The ELN says that they want peace, but they give this ridiculous mandate to the negotiating team. But if they really want peace, as they say, okay, let's negotiate seriously. I think there's a lot of discourse versus action where there's a gap to be closed, and a lot of that is giving the ELN the opportunity to fail on their discourse. That type of political pressure, even someone like Pablito can't handle that political pressure as openly as he would like. But I would close there, trying to bring it all.
Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah.
Awesome. Elizabeth, over to you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I have little to add. I think Kyle really covered it. Look, on the sort of local and bottom-up negotiations, I think two things that work in its favor and two things that work against it. I think we have to remember that sort of the idea of doing things locally and making decisions locally is in complete cognitive dissonance with the entire organization of the Colombian state. Colombia is an extremely centralized government to the extent that, if you are a community who's looking for potable water, you're more likely to get a response if you send a delegation to Bogota than you are if you drive to your, the alcaldía. Just the way that the state works and the way that they particularly handle issues of security and things that they would see as sort of like vital national, national interest are just so concentrated in Bogota, and the experiences of consultative processes that they've attempted to run, for example, in the peace accord with negotiating development projects linked to the peace accord, is like they have the consultations on the ground and the bureaucrats from Bogota go and take notes, and then they disappear for 2 years, and just make all the decisions themselves. So, I think there is a fundamental tension here in sort of the way that Colombia works and what we would be proposing in terms of a local organization. I think the second real obstacle to the local organization, to the local sort of approach, really is this issue of the other armed groups. And it's a puzzle that the peace agreement with the FARC was supposed to solve and didn't. And I think this is actually one of the most crucial failures of the agreement so far with the or the way it's being implemented more precisely, which is that there are mechanisms in the peace accord with the FARC that were intended to create a way to dismantle paramilitarism. So these other, sort of trafficking organizations. And all of that is just completely frozen. The mechanisms that were supposed to create a plan, the participatory process that was created and the specific commission that was made to lay this in place, I think that is a real problem, because since we haven't solved that puzzle, any negotiation that you have, particularly at a local level now with the conflict so fragmented and the rents, the stakes for illegal rents being so high on a local level, if you don't have a good answer to that question of who fills the space, no one will believe you if you say the state will fill it, because clearly they won't. And no one will believe you if you say that they will dismantle the paramilitary groups, because clearly they won't. So we have to solve this puzzle, I think, if we're going to actually make any progress on the ground at a territorial level, because the stakes are just too high. Things that work, I think, in favor of sort of a more local approach is exactly the sort of experiences I think that Kyle mentioned, which is that there are experiences of informal, I wouldn't call them necessarily agreements, but like accommodations between these groups and populations. And it's not always nice, it's not always ideal, it's not always, it's often more coercive than we would, if we looked at it objectively, we would like. But there are experiences, communities themselves have to figure out how to live with these actors. And so there is some sort of, approach, and it can be done. And there are other examples in addition to the one that Kyle mentioned. There's a really interesting one from Cauca as well, which included businessmen. The importance of including businessmen is really key here. And I think it's something that we miss a lot, because it's something the ELN cares about a lot. And it's something that's very fundamental to the political construction of the state in terms of where the key constituencies are. You have to include the businesses because that really underlines all of the electoral politics that we see at a local level. And if you want to win a local mayor seat, or if you want to win, a congressional seat, you really have to have these networks in the business community and the land ownership that's vital to your success politically. And so if they're not involved in a process like this of sorting out local conflicts, any solution that you reach will be really quite unsustainable, because they will just push so hard against it. And they have a lot of levers in their favor. They have obviously the money, but they also have the political machinery to push against it. So you don't include them, and it's really sort of a self-suicide mission. I guess the sort of last thing that I will mention is this idea of like going into the 2022 elections. Look, it's a little bit of a pessimistic view. Colombia, particularly following the pandemic, now 5 years in the peace accord, is in a little bit of a free fall, economically, politically, in terms of the implementation of the agreement. This is really a crisis moment, and I don't see any real solutions. The insecurity particularly in rural areas has worsened so significantly, and there is no thinking, there's no fresh imagination about how to deal with this situation. I think there's a lot of sort of just beating the same drums and pulling the same levers that they have in the past, not realizing that not only are they not working, but they're often making the situation worse. Now, how does that affect the potential for a negotiation with the ELN? This is the kind of situation that favors a movement like the ELN. Why? Because all the ELN has to do to win is survive. Their definition of success is survival. And so to survive another day in the field, to survive another day fighting, they can do that. And in fact, the sort of conflictivity that's been generated by the economic crisis, by the failure of the government to control the security situation, by the exacerbated social situation thanks to the pandemic, this just creates a really volatile mix that I think can be taken advantage of, and has been taken advantage of, not only by the ELN, but a whole range of actors who sort of prey upon this misery and conflictivity to empower themselves. That's a little bit of obviously it's not a little bit of a pessimistic view, it's a very pessimistic view. But I mean, the flip side of that is that, the incoming government is gonna have to find a way to turn things around. And I think part of that equation will be realizing that there are conflicts that have to be unraveled, that you're not going to unravel through force. If they can make that key, if we can get that idea at least planted into the political platforms of candidates going into 22, I think we can call that the start of a success or a start of an opportunity, because it's not there in the political debate right now. We don't talk, this government does not talk about how to unravel this movement as a political phenomenon. It is all about sort of criminality. And I think to make that shift is important, and to get that fresh thinking again on the table.
Elizabeth, thanks so much. And Kyle, it's been fantastic to have you here. I think we have gone over an hour and a half now. It's been a really good dialogue. I'm really extremely grateful to you. And on behalf of the Winchester Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace and Embrace Dialogue, just really want to thank you for all the food for thought that you have offered to us. And I hope that this is the first of many dialogues that we can have with you, because we know that you know more about the conflict in Colombia than what's happening with the ELN, and you've been working on really important issues in Colombia. So thank you so much for this. I'm not going to try to summarize for everyone what has been said here, but let me just say that, at least for me, there are two things that I take away in terms of the conflict dynamics, and two things that I take away in terms of paving the way for peace. In terms of the conflict dynamics, I think we have been discussing here the importance of understanding the regional settings and how these actors interact and are trying to control regions where there is drug trafficking. The second element that I think has been quite important, and you've been mentioning here, is the importance of looking at the international dimension, in particular Venezuela, and the complexity of the relationship between the ELN and the Venezuelan authorities, and also the private sector in Venezuela and the concerns that they might have in terms of the consolidation of the ELN there, and if there is a change of government. So I think those two elements are being really important to try to understand the complexity of this issue that we're tackling with. And in terms of the peace process, or the possible peace negotiations, or the paving the way for peace, I think the two key points that I take away is, first try to think about bottom-up approaches of small agreements, probably at the humanitarian dimension, to think that there is the possibility of crafting different types of agreements, that is not just one big national one, but there is a way of scaling up and thinking about, again, because of the regional focus of the conflict, the regional approaches to this and try to alleviate humanitarian situation. But mainly that if we really want to take this into a national negotiation, probably this is a moment to try to build the bricks and try to see the opportunities that a new government would bring for this, because both of you mainly have been telling us that with this government, it is very difficult to see a negotiation taking off, and even if it were to start, it wouldn't be very long-lived. So I think, with those 4 things that I think has been shared here, I just want to close this space and invite our participants to turn their microphones on if you want, and to give a round of applause to our guest speakers. And thank you all for coming this time to this event of Rodemos el Diálogo.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you in the next dialogue. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.